Hello and welcome back to Wine with Andy. I'm Andy, and today we're getting into the third of our nature versus nurture tastings. We're going to be getting back to nature, and we're going to be doing that with the help of a couple of Semillon wines. I gave you last time the details of the wines you'd need to taste along with me. One of them was a Semillon from Hunter Valley or Barossa Valley in Australia, and I wanted you to look out for one that was 11.5% alcohol or lower. I've got one here from the Hunter Valley, and it is 11% in alcohol. The other wine I wanted you to look out for was a Semillon from the sweet wine section of your supermarket wine aisle. I wanted you to get a Semillon that had been affected by Botrytis. Now, I gave you some suggestions for names to look for on the labels. One of those was Sauternes from the Bordeaux wine region of France, and it is a bottle of Sauternes, a small bottle of Sauternes that I've got here to taste today. Hopefully you've been able to find something similar, even if it's not exactly the same as what I've got here. It doesn't matter. If it fits the principles, that's perfect. Now let's get straight into tasting. I've got my two identical wine glasses here. They're identical, of course, because the only thing that we want different between the two is the wine inside them, not the glasses. So let's get pouring. I'm going to pour my table wine, the Semillon from the Hunter Valley, in my left-hand glass. There we go. Up to the widest part of the glass there. And then the sweet Semillon into my right-hand glass. There we go. Now, of course, the first step of any wine tasting is not tasting at all, but looking. And I reckon you can probably see, even through the video, there's quite a difference in the colour of these wines. But let's do things properly. Let's pick them up and tilt them against a light-coloured background to have a proper look. Yes, definitely a difference. Now, my dry wine is a very pale sort of straw colour. I say straw because it's sort of a yellow tinged with a little bit of green, but it's very pale. And the wine here, the sweet wine rather, is clearly a golden yellow. It's very much darker. And now there is something we can think of straight away that might be the reason. We know, of course, that these are both Semillons. They're both the same grape variety. And grape variety is one of those things that really makes a huge difference to the colour of the wine. But that's not what's going on here, because they're both the same. One of the other things that makes a big difference is age. And I can see, looking at the bottles here, that my dry wine is actually from 2018, whereas my sweet wine is from 2011. So it's 7 years older. And in that 7 years, it's had time to oxidize a bit more, and oxidation brings darkening in colour in white wines. So the age is connected to the darkness of the colour. So that sort of older, the fact that one is older might be one reason that wine is a bit darker. We'll get onto some other reasons later on in this tasting, but that's definitely one part of the puzzle. Let's get into sniffing, see if we can spot some more differences between these two. Going into the dry wine first. Now, I've got my first impression of the fruit. I've got lemons. Definitely citrus, definitely sort of a yellowy, citrusy fruit, so lemons, maybe a little bit of sort of white grapefruit. I've got maybe something a bit melony, that kind of crisp, juicy fruit, but quite ripe tasting, or smelling rather. And then alongside that, I've got something a little bit metallic, maybe a little bit smoky, perhaps. There's certainly something a little bit more on top of that, but maybe I'll get a bit more on that in a second when I swirl it. I'll move over to the sweet wine just a second now. Immediate, hugely different. It smells sweet for a start, which is of course not actually a thing because you can't smell sugar, but it smells jammier, it smells like marmalade, there's definitely something of that kind of metallic sort of hint about it as well. But it's got the very faintest whiff of sort of blue cheese as well. But very, very faint underneath the really quite intense fruit. Let's swirl and stiff, see if we get anything a bit more. I'm going to do this on the table for safety. There we go, number one. What do I get? Well, actually, interestingly enough, I get more of that slightly struck match, smoky, metallic tang, and I get maybe less of the fruit after the swirl there. Maybe something a little bit green creeping in as well, sort of the edge of cut grass or of sort of green bell pepper. Something like that in there. Let's move over to the sweet wine, see what we get on that. Oh, more marmalade. Oh, more sort of, it's actually quite caramelized kind of marmalade, dark marmalade. And grapefruit in terms of the fruit, it's sort of aromatic grapefruit, so more of a pink grapefruit than a white grapefruit perhaps. Now it's probably worth at this point just going back and forth a little bit to see if we can spot the sort of core of similarity, because these are from the same grapes. Now I'm going to pick both of them up and just sniff back and forth. In fact, I'm going to give them a little swirl, both of them first, and then we're going to alternate with my nose. So yes, that kind of grapefruity note, which is more white grapefruit in this one and more pink grapefruit in this one, is similar, and that kind of slightly metallic tang on the edge is also similar in both of these wines. But other than that, there's clearly a huge difference going on. And I think that difference is only going to get bigger when I put it in my mouth. So let's test that theory out now. So, what have we got? Let's think about the things that we can get on the palate that we don't get on the nose. So, sugar, no. This is a dry wine. I'm not really detecting any sugar on it. Acid, yes. There's quite a lot of acid there. I'm getting a good tingle on the tongue. Tingle on the tongue. Alcohol, I'm not really getting any burn on the back of my throat. Not surprising given that this is 11%. We're not expecting alcohol to be standing out on this one. I'm getting a really nice balance of that sort of crisp citrus flavour with that acid and that sort of tingliness. I'm getting a little bit of, the fruit has definitely come back to the fore on the palate, and that sort of metallic note is receding a little bit in the mouth. I'll switch over to the sweet wine, and I'm going to be careful with this one. I'm going to hold it in my mouth. I'm expecting it to be sweet. I know it's sweet. It came from the sweet wine section, so I know there's going to be some sugar on that. And sugar, of course, is really good at masking acidity. So I'm going to be really careful to hold it in my mouth a little bit longer to really focus on detecting the tingle of that acidity on my tongue to see how high it is. So, immediately on getting that in my mouth, the sugar is obvious. It's not sickly sweet, but it is definitely sweet. I've got, holding it there on my tongue a bit, I've definitely got a lot of acid. I might even say a smidge more acid than the dry wine. It's certainly on the same sort of level, but it might be a little bit higher. Besides the acid, I've got a lovely rush of that marmalade flavour. I've got a sort of slightly orange peely, is that aromatic citrus note, orange peel or pink grapefruity note coming through really nicely as well. And as I swallow it, I've got a long finish. I can still taste it as I'm speaking to you now. It's still going on. Very long finish on this. Clearly quite concentrated flavours, quite intense flavours that are lasting quite a while. And the finish is kind of, it's basically dry. There's a little bit of sweetness left on the finish, but it's basically dry. It's not cloying particularly in my mouth, which tells me that the acid and the sugar are quite nicely balanced on this one. That's an interesting comparison. I think if I now go back to this one, I'm going to find that it really tastes quite sort of thin, because I've not got the sort of the thickness, the unctuousness of the sugar, making it feel sort of richer and oilier. And I feel like I'm going to probably find it quite acidic and quite sharp. Yeah, so the acid really stands out on that now, having had the sweet one before. But I can definitely detect there's that similarity of flavour a little bit on the fruit. So while you continue to sip away and spot the similarities and the differences between these two wines, I'm going to spend a little time looking at why they taste similar and why they taste different. Now, the similar bit is pretty easy. They're both made from Semillon grapes, so that explains that similar core of fruit. Both the same grape, both the same fruit. Easy enough. The differences, well, for both of these wines, something has happened in the vineyard to make a difference to the flavour. For this one, for the dry one, what we've got is something similar to what we looked at in the first of these nature versus nurture tastings. In that tasting, we were tasting two Sauvignon Blancs back to back. And on one of them, you had this quite distinct green pepper smell, which we figured out came from the fact that those grapes were picked when the sugar level was at the right sort of concentration to get the alcohol that the winemaker wanted in the final wine. But the grapes were maybe not totally physiologically ripe yet, so you get this sort of green, underripe green pepper smell. And you've got something very similar to this now. There's a clue in the label. I asked you to find something from Australia, from some hot places in Australia, and I wanted you to look at the alcohol level and find something that was 11.5% or lower. This one's 11%. Now, Australia being a hot place is perfectly capable of growing grapes with enough sugar to create much higher than this alcohol level in the final wine. So there's a clue that something has happened to keep that low, just from the fact that it's from a hot place and it's reasonably low in alcohol. And actually it's pretty much the same sort of thing. What they've done is deliberately picked the grapes when the sugar levels in them are right to produce that amount of alcohol in the final wine, rather than waiting for the grapes to be totally physiologically ripe. And that smell, that choice rather, has caused that very slight green smell that I picked up at one point, but perhaps more prominently, it's caused that kind of slightly smoky, slightly metallic tang to the notes that I was picking up in the dry wine here. So that explains that. For the sweet wine, there's something else happening. Again, there's a clue in what I asked you to look out for. I asked you to look out for a Semillon wine that was affected by botrytis. And it is botrytis that has caused the difference here. Botrytis is a special type of mould, a type of fungus, that grows on the skins of the grapes. And what happens is that the fungus punctures the skins, creates little tiny holes through which the water inside the grape can escape. The grape can start sort of drying out while still on the vine. And that drying out process concentrates the compounds inside the grape. It concentrates the sugar, it concentrates the flavour compounds, and it concentrates the colour compounds. So that explains why we have more sugar, a really intense flavour, and a darker colour, as well as the age, of course, that I mentioned before. The sugar, of course, well, you might think, well, it's not flowing straight from the grapes into the wine because there's yeast in the middle that's turning the sugar into alcohol. So there's something going on in the middle as well. But what's happening is that the sugar level is so high that the yeast produces enough alcohol that it just can't keep going. It essentially poisons itself, gives itself alcohol poisoning before it can use up all of the sugar. So the yeast finishes fermenting, it dies off before it's used up all of that sugar, and there's sugar left in the final wine, as of course we can taste today. Now, let's get on to thinking about the wines. I'm not going to ask you this time to think about which you prefer, because these are really very different categories of wine. But I will ask you to think about what you might like to match them with, how you might like to use these styles of wine. And for the dry wine, well, you've got that kind of rich citrusy fruit. You've got that slightly smoky edge to it, and that really helps match with foods that you'd think of going with citrusy stuff. So think of fish dishes, a sort of robust white fish dish. You could have white meat like chicken. You might have a nice lemon chicken kind of a dish. That would match really well with this, or just your average roast chicken, in fact, would match really nicely with a Semillon in this style. And I really love this style of Semillon, but I also really love this style of Semillon. What would this go with? Well, I mentioned blue cheese. That linkage with the mouldy smell is part of the reason, but you also have the intensity of flavour matching the intensity of the blue cheese flavour. And you have the really high acid in this wine being able to cut through the fattiness of the blue cheese. Other things it would match with, well, if you think about matching the sweetness, then you can think about matching it with something like a creme brulee, where the sweetness matches with the caramel, as does the caramelly flavours from sort of marmalade-y notes in that wine. Matches with that sweetness of the topping, and then the acid again helps cut through the creaminess of the custard underneath. So things like that, where you've got creaminess and a rich, perhaps citrusy sweetness, will match really well with this one. Also go quite nicely with a bread and butter pudding. Again, you've got the sort of the sweetness from a nice brown sugar topping. You've got the creaminess from the custard in the bread pudding mix underneath as well. So some good matches there for those two wines. I'm sure you can come up with other good matches based on the sort of those matching principles, matching with the flavours, matching with the sweetness as well. Now, I think it's time to have a look at the wines for next time. So next time will, I'm afraid, be the last of this series of Nature versus Nurture tastings. And for this last tasting, I'm going to ask you to find a couple of red wines. We're going to be flipping back to look at nurture. So we did nature this time with some vineyard management type things that can make a difference to the final wine. Next time it's back to stuff that the winemaker really controls after the grapes are picked. So I'm going to ask you to look out for a couple of wines from the Burgundy wine region of France. I want you to find one Burgundy made from Pinot Noir, so there's a huge number of Burgundies made from Pinot Noir, and I'm sure you'll have no difficulty finding one in your supermarket. Pick whatever you like, probably a basic level Burgundy. This is your sort of entry level Burgundy. Here it just says Bourgogne, which of course is just French for Burgundy, on the front of the bottle there. This one also, rather helpfully for a French wine, says Pinot Noir, but we could have named that anyway from the fact that it has Bourgogne there. The other wine I'd like you to get is a Beaujolais. Beaujolais is a sort of separate sub-region of Burgundy. I've got one called a Beaujolais Village, which is, or Beaujolais Village if you're trying to be properly French, and it is from a place in sort of the very south end of Burgundy, but Beaujolais is made from a different grape called Gamay, and so try to find one Beaujolais and one Pinot Noir Burgundy for next time. And until then, I will leave you to continue enjoying your wines. I will enjoy mine, and I'll look forward to tasting the final couple of wines in this series with you next time. Cheers!